You wake up on Sunday night. Nothing has happened yet. No alarm has gone off. No email has landed. No boss has said your name. And yet your stomach tightens. Your shoulders climb toward your ears. Somewhere behind your ribs, a small alarm starts ringing for an event that is still 9 hours away. You call this the Sunday scaries. But here's the strange part. Your brain isn't reacting to Monday. Monday hasn't happened yet. Your brain is reacting to a prediction. And that prediction is older than your job, older than your calendar, older than the very idea of a 7-day week. What if the thing you call Monday dread isn't really about Monday at all? Let's start with the body, not the mind. Because the body always tells the truth first, long before you have found the words for what you are feeling. Inside your skull, just above where your optic nerves cross, sits a cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons. Tiny, smaller than a grain of rice. Scientists call it the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but you can think of it more simply as your BOTUS head office. Every other clock in your body checks in there for instructions. It tracks light. It tracks darkness. It tracks subtle shifts in temperature. And based on those signals, it decides when to release cortisol, the hormone that drags you up out of sleep and into alertness. Cortisol gets a bad reputation. People call it the stress hormone, as if it only ever causes harm. But you actually need it. Without a healthy cortisol rhythm, you stay groggy and limp long after sunrise, your body never quite convinced that the day had started. Cortisol's job is to say get moving, and for most of human history, that single command meant the difference between catching breakfast and becoming someone else's. This daily surge even has its own name among sleep researchers. They call it the cortisol awakening response, a sharp rise in cortisol that typically peaks within the first half hour after you open your eyes. It's normal. It's healthy. It's the biological equivalent of a stage manager flicking the house lights on before a performance. But the size and timing of that surge isn't fixed. It bends to your schedule, your stress levels, and crucially, to how predictable your sleep has been in the days before. But cortisol doesn't rise by the same amount every day. And this is where things get interesting. A German chronobiologist named Till Rinneberg spent years studying something he eventually gave a name. He called it social jet lag. Rinneberg noticed a simple pattern hiding inside ordinary life. Most people do not sleep the same hours on a Saturday as they do on a Tuesday. On the weekend, you drift. You stay up later because nothing forces you not to. You sleep in because your body, left alone, settles into a rhythm of its own choosing. Then Monday arrives, and without warning, you have to drag that drifted body backward, forcing it to obey a clock it never agreed to. Rinneberg compared this to actual jet lag. Real jet lag, the kind caused by flying across time zones. Except you never left your bed. You never boarded a plane. Your body simply lived in two different time zones within the same week. One set by your own internal preference, the other set entirely by your job. Think about how strange that is. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is recovering from real jet lag after flying from New York to Tokyo. And somewhere much closer, maybe in the room you are sitting in right now, you are recovering from a nearly identical biological event without ever going anywhere at all. And your body pays a price for that switch every single week. Quietly, repeatedly, forever, unless something interrupts the pattern. Researchers eventually wanted to know if this was just a feeling or something you could actually measure inside the body. So they looked. In one study, scientists collected cells from hair follicles, tiny samples taken gently from the root, and examined the activity of specific clock genes inside them. Genes with names like PER3, NR1D1, and NR1D2, genes that quietly govern your internal rhythm the way gears govern the inside of a watch. The researchers tested a group of people on a Friday. Then they tested the very same people again on the following Monday. The clock genes had shifted, not just the way people described feeling. The actual molecular machinery inside their cells had moved, like a watch that had been gently knocked out of time. And the size of that shift correlated almost exactly with each person's social jet lag, with how far their weekend sleep schedule had drifted from their weekday one. Read that again, slowly. Your cells know what day of the week it is before your conscious mind has even finished waking up. So when you feel that familiar tightening on a Sunday night, that is not weakness. That is not some character flaw you need to apologize for. That is a measurable, physical, gene-level event occurring on a schedule inside your own body. You are not imagining the dread. In a very literal sense, a strand of your own hair could tell a scientist what day it is, just by revealing which genes are turned up and which are turned down. Not everyone feels this dread with the same intensity, and that variation itself turns out to be biological rather than a matter of willpower or attitude. Sleep researchers use the term chronotype to describe your body's natural preference for when to sleep and when to wake, a preference that sits on a spectrum running from strong morning types to strong evening types, with most people falling somewhere in the middle. The Friday to Monday clock gene study found something telling along exactly this line. People classified as morning types, whose natural rhythm already leans toward early rising, showed clear, significant shifts in their clock gene timing between Friday and Monday. People classified as evening types, whose natural rhythm leans later, did not show the same significant pattern. In other words, if your body naturally wants to rise early and a 5-day work schedule happens to roughly match that preference, the weekly transition costs you relatively little. But if your body is a natural evening type, biologically wired to feel most alert late at night and most groggy early in the morning, and your job nonetheless demands an early start every single weekday, you are essentially fighting your own internal clock 5 days out of every 7. The dread you feel on Sunday night may not simply be about work. It may be the anticipation of an entire week spent working against your own biology, a mismatch that has nothing to do with motivation and everything to do with the timing of your internal cortisol release. This is part of why advice to simply go to bed earlier on Sunday rarely solves the problem on its own. For a strong evening type, falling asleep substantially earlier than their body wants to isn't a matter of discipline. It's closer to trying to fall asleep at noon. The body resists because the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that tiny head office of clocks, hasn't received the signals it needs to believe sleep is actually appropriate yet. That is a remarkably heavy thing for a hormone and a small cluster of genes to be quietly managing every single week for your entire life. But cortisol and clock genes only explain the biology of the feeling. They don't explain its texture. They don't explain why Monday dread feels less like ordinary tiredness and more like something closer to doom. For that, you have to go back. Not back to last week. Back roughly 2 million years. Picture an early hominin standing at the edge of a clearing. Behind them, a small group, vulnerable, slow-moving, easy to injure. Ahead of them, the unknown. Maybe food, maybe nothing. Their brain did something remarkable in that exact moment. Something your brain still does today without asking your permission. It didn't wait for the danger to reveal itself before reacting. It began preparing the instant danger became merely possible. Heart rate rising, muscles tightening, senses sharpening. All of it triggered not by a confirmed threat, but by the bare suggestion of one. This tendency, this bias toward expecting and waiting the worst, has a name in psychology. Researchers sometimes call it the negativity bias, a pattern documented extensively by the psychologist Roy Baumeister and his collaborators. Across dozens of studies spanning decades, they found something remarkably consistent. Bad events and bad emotions simply weigh more heavily in the human mind than good ones of an equal size. A single sharp criticism can outweigh several genuine compliments. One bad day can erase the emotional residue of several good ones. This isn't pessimism as a personality trait. It's closer to arithmetic, a kind of math your brain runs constantly, without ever asking whether you would like it to. So why would evolution build a brain that overweights bad news so consistently? Because of a brutal asymmetry buried in the math of survival. If your distant ancestor wrongly assumed a rustle in the bushes was nothing, and it turned out to be a predator, that single mistake could end their life, and possibly the lives of everyone depending on them. But if they wrongly assumed the rustle was a predator, and it turned out to be nothing, the cost was tiny. A few wasted seconds of fear. A racing heart that calmed back down a minute later. One kind of error is fatal. The other kind of error is mildly inconvenient. Natural selection, over countless generations, did the math on that asymmetry, and it built brains accordingly. Brains that would rather sound 1,000 false alarms than miss one real threat. You inherited that exact brain, unmodified, running the same ancient software, now executing inside a world that no longer hides predators in the grass. You can see traces of this same asymmetry almost everywhere once you start looking. It's why a single bad review can outweigh 50 good ones in a business owner's mind. It's why a single awkward silence in a conversation can replay in your head for hours, long after the rest of the conversation went perfectly well. It's why, of all the hundreds of ordinary, uneventful Mondays you have actually lived through, your memory clings tightly to the handful that genuinely went wrong and quietly discards the dozens that were simply fine. Your brain isn't keeping an honest, balanced ledger. It's keeping a security log, and security logs are written by a part of you that only cares about catching danger, never about celebrating the days nothing happened. So picture this. Now swap the predator for your inbox. Your brain, it turns out, cannot reliably tell the difference between a literal physical threat and a looming social or professional one. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, who spent much of his career studying stress physiology in both animals and humans, points out something almost darkly comic about modern life. A zebra's stress response switches off the moment the lion gives up the chase. The danger passes, and so does the fear, cleanly, completely. Yours doesn't work that way. You can trigger an almost identical hormonal cascade simply by thinking about a meeting that hasn't happened yet, scheduled for a day that hasn't arrived yet, about a topic you don't even fully understand yet. So on a quiet Sunday evening, your ancient threat detection system gets handed a brand new kind of clearing to stare into. Not a literal forest, a calendar. And it does exactly what it was built, over millions of years, to do. It starts scanning for danger before any danger has actually shown itself. An unanswered email becomes the rustle in the grass. A short, vague message from your manager saying simply, "Let's talk Monday," becomes the shape moving just out of sight in the shadows. A blank space on next week's calendar, not yet filled with meetings, becomes its own quiet source of unease, because an empty clearing can hide just as much uncertainty as a crowded one. Your imagination doesn't need concrete evidence of trouble to start manufacturing it. It only needs an absence of information, a gap it instinctively wants to fill, and left with nothing else to fill that gap, it almost always reaches for the worst available guess. Your brain doesn't know that none of this is an actual predator. It only recognizes the pattern. Uncertainty ahead. Prepare immediately, just in case. Here is the part almost nobody mentions when they talk about hating Mondays. This dread isn't really about Monday being objectively worse than any other day. Time use research comparing weekdays consistently finds that the actual content of a typical Monday isn't dramatically different from a Tuesday or a Wednesday. A similar number of meetings, a similar workload. The misery, in other words, isn't really happening on Monday itself. The misery happens the night before, in anticipation, and research on anticipatory anxiety has repeatedly found that the dread leading up to an event is often more intense, more vivid, and more exhausting than the discomfort of actually living through the event, which means you suffer the meeting twice. Once on Sunday night, in your imagination, rehearsed in vivid, exaggerated, worst-case detail, and once again on Monday itself, almost always far more mildly than you expected, because reality rarely matches the catastrophe your mind rehearsed for you. So the truly strange discovery hiding underneath all of this is simple. Mondays themselves are mostly innocent. What you actually fear is the unknown shape of the week ahead, and your ancient, well-meaning brain insists on rehearsing every possible disaster in advance, just to be safe, long before you are permitted to relax. So why does this feeling concentrate so specifically around the transition into a new work week, rather than spreading out evenly across all your daily worries? Because humans evolved as deeply social, deeply group-dependent animals. For nearly the entire span of human history, your survival depended almost completely on your standing within your group. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies, hunter-gatherer groups whose ways of life still resemble much of our evolutionary past, consistently find that social standing, reciprocity, and group approval functioned as a kind of currency more valuable than almost any physical possession. Being cast out of the group wasn't simply unpleasant. In an environment full of predators, scarce food, and harsh weather, it was very often a death sentence. Work, for most people living today, is the closest modern equivalent to that ancient tribe. It's where your competence gets quietly judged, where your usefulness gets measured week after week, where your standing among other people gets renegotiated, sometimes without you even noticing, meeting by meeting, message by message. So when Sunday night arrives, and the work week looms ahead of you, you are not simply dreading a list of tasks on a calendar. Some far older, far more primitive part of you is bracing itself for judgment, bracing to discover whether you are still useful, still respected, still safely inside the boundaries of the group. That is a remarkably heavy question for a single hormone surge to be quietly carrying every single week on your behalf. Consider how differently exclusion would have felt 40,000 years ago compared to how it feels now. Today, a cold response from a coworker stings, but you still go home, you still eat dinner, you still have a roof over your head regardless of how the workplace politics shake out that particular week. 40,000 years ago, the calculation was nowhere near so forgiving. A small band of perhaps 20 to 50 people represented your entire support system. Your food-sharing network, your defense against predators, your only source of help if you were injured or sick. Anthropological research on contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, including extensive work by researchers studying cooperative food sharing and reciprocity norms, consistently shows that being viewed as unreliable, selfish, or simply unhelpful by the group carried consequences that rippled through every part of daily survival. There was no separate, private life to retreat into if the group soured on you. The group was the whole of your life. That history is precisely why modern workplace anxiety borrows the emotional intensity of something that used to be a matter of life and death, even though missing a deadline today rarely threatens your physical survival. Your nervous system hasn't caught up to that distinction. It still treats social risk and physical risk as roughly the same category of problem, because for almost the entirety of human history, they effectively were the same problem. Now here's a twist worth sitting with for a moment. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies, including extensive fieldwork among groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Jusi of Southern Africa, have repeatedly found something that surprises most people raised inside a modern work culture. These societies typically did not work anything resembling a 40-hour week. Estimates from multiple studies suggest many hunter-gatherer adults spent somewhere between 15 and 20 hours per week on tasks directly related to securing food, supplemented by time spent on tools, shelter, and social life, but without anything resembling a fixed 5-day schedule, a recurring Monday, or a boss waiting to evaluate their performance on a specific morning. There was no Monday for most of human history. Not really. There was light and dark. There was hunger and rest. There were seasons, migrations, and the unpredictable rhythms of weather and herd movement. But there was no fixed, recurring, externally imposed transition that arrived every 7 days, demanding that your body and mind snap suddenly back into a particular shape. Picture a typical day for one of those groups instead. Morning might begin slowly, with no fixed start time, no alarm, no expectation that everyone rise at the same moment. Some people might head out to gather plants or dig roots. Others might track animals, a task that could take hours or, just as often, end in nothing at all, with no penalty attached to coming home empty-handed. Afternoons often left long stretches of unstructured time spent on conversation, storytelling, tool repair, childcare, or simply rest in the shade. Evenings frequently centered around a fire, shared food, and talk that anthropologists studying these groups have noted often had little to do with practical survival at all, focusing instead on social bonding, gossip, and stories that reinforced group cohesion. Compare that rhythm to the one you live inside now. A fixed start time, a fixed number of hours, regardless of how the work is actually going. A boundary between Friday and Monday so sharp and so absolute that an entire vocabulary, the Sunday scaries, the Monday blues, has sprung up just to describe the emotional bruise it leaves behind. Nothing in that ancient daily rhythm prepared your nervous system for a transition this abrupt, this rigid, or this relentlessly recurring. The 7-day week itself is a surprisingly recent invention in the long story of human existence. Historians trace its widespread adoption to a combination of ancient Babylonian astronomy, where the 7 visible moving objects in the sky, the sun, the moon, and 5 planets, were each associated with a day, and later to religious traditions that reinforced a recurring day of rest. The structure spread gradually across cultures and empires, eventually becoming so deeply embedded in daily life that almost nobody today questions it. The specific, dreaded shape of the modern Monday is even younger than the week itself. The 5-day, Monday through Friday work pattern most people now take for granted only became widespread during the industrial era, and in many countries it solidified as recently as the 20th century, as labor movements pushed for a standardized weekend. Before that, work for most people followed the rhythm of seasons, harvests, and daylight, not a uniform grid stamped across every week of the year regardless of weather, mood, or need. The dread you feel on Sunday night is, in a very real sense, only a few generations old, riding on top of biological machinery that is millions of years old. But your brain, your cortisol rhythms, your ancient threat detection circuitry, none of that evolved with the 7-day week in mind. It evolved across hundreds of thousands of years without one. You are, in a very real sense, running a calendar invented a few thousand years ago on top of hardware built across millions of years for a completely different kind of life. That mismatch alone goes a long way toward explaining the specific, sudden, almost ritualistic quality of Sunday night dread. It isn't simply tiredness. It is the friction between an ancient nervous system, exquisitely tuned to react to unpredictable, survival-relevant change, and a thoroughly modern institution that manufactures a predictable, recurring transition every single week, whether your body is ready for it or not. Think about how oddly specific the modern ritual of Sunday night actually is once you start paying attention to it. The slow, draining feeling that arrives sometime around dinner. The reluctance to start anything new, because starting something new on a Sunday evening feels somehow pointless, swallowed up by the looming week ahead. The strange comfort of staying up slightly too late, as if delaying sleep might also delay Monday itself, even though everyone doing it knows, on some level, that it won't. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a Sunday evening too. Fewer messages arrive. Fewer notifications buzz. The outside world quiets down just enough that your own thoughts get louder. And in that quiet, your ancient threat detection circuitry doesn't get to rest. It gets to wander, scanning for anything resembling a threat, because that's precisely the environment it evolved to operate in. Stillness, low stimulation, just enough quiet to notice every possible danger lurking at the edges of what's coming next. Psychologists who study anticipation point out that the brain treats an uncertain future event almost like an unsolved puzzle, one it cannot simply set aside. Studies on what researchers call the Zeigarnik effect, named after the psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who first documented it in the 1920s, found that unfinished or pending tasks tend to linger in memory and intrude on conscious thought far more persistently than completed ones. A meeting that hasn't happened yet, a presentation still ahead of you, a decision still unmade, all of it sits in your mind like an unclosed loop, quietly demanding attention even when you are trying to relax on your own couch, on your own Sunday evening, technically still free. So your mind keeps circling back, not because you are choosing to worry, because the open loop itself, the unresolved nature of the week ahead, has a kind of psychological gravity. It pulls your attention toward it again and again, the same way an unanswered question nags at you long after you have stopped actively thinking about it. But here is the twist inside the twist, the part that actually changes how this feeling can sit with you going forward. If Monday dread is mostly anticipation, mostly an ancient alarm system misfiring at a calendar instead of a predator, then the feeling itself is not a forecast. It is not secretly informing you that the coming day will genuinely be terrible. It is simply your nervous system doing precisely what nervous systems have always done, preparing intensely for the worst, just in case, regardless of how likely the worst actually is. And once you understand that, the feeling starts to lose some of its grip over you. Not because you can simply switch it off through willpower alone. You can't. It's wired in far too deeply, sharpened across far too many generations of selection pressure, to disappear just because you have read an explanation of it. But you can begin to recognize it for exactly what it is. A leftover survival reflex, firing at the wrong target, inside a world utterly unlike the one that originally built it. There is something genuinely hopeful buried inside the social jet lag research, too. Some studies tracking sleep schedules have found that people who keep their weekend sleep timing closer to their weekday timing, even by something as small as 30 or 40 minutes, show measurably smaller shifts in those same clock genes. Smaller drops in mood. Smaller spikes in next-day fatigue. You cannot abolish 2 million years of inherited threat detection through a better bedtime routine. But you can, in a small and very real way, narrow the gap your body is forced to leap across every single week, simply by giving it a slightly more consistent rhythm to anchor onto. There's a similar kind of relief available on the psychological side. Researchers studying anticipatory anxiety have found that simply naming what's happening, recognizing a feeling as anticipation rather than as an accurate prediction, can measurably reduce its intensity. Not eliminate it. Reduce it. The dread doesn't need to be silenced to lose some of its power. It just needs to be correctly identified for what it actually is, a rehearsal, not a forecast. Something closer to a fire drill than an actual fire. It's also worth noticing how much modern work culture has accidentally amplified this ancient reflex rather than soothed it. Constant connectivity means the boundary between rest and readiness has nearly dissolved. A notification arriving at 9 on a Sunday night doesn't just deliver information, it delivers a small jolt of exactly the uncertainty your threat detection system was built to respond to. Decades ago, the work week genuinely ended when you left the building, and there was no buzzing rectangle in your pocket capable of reopening that loop at any hour. Today, the clearing your ancient brain scans for danger never fully goes dark. There's always a faint light at the edge of it. Always the possibility of one more message that might mean something has gone wrong. This helps explain why the feeling has, if anything, grown more widespread rather than less. Even as physical danger in daily life has dropped dramatically compared to almost any earlier point in human history. Surveys of workers across multiple countries have repeatedly found that a large share of people report some degree of dread or anxiety specifically tied to the approach of the work week, a finding so consistent across cultures and industries that researchers studying occupational stress treat it less like an individual quirk and more like a near-universal feature of modern working life. You are not an outlier for feeling this. You are, statistically speaking, the norm. None of this means the discomfort is fake, or that you should simply think your way out of feeling it. The tightening in your chest on a Sunday evening is real. The reluctance to open your laptop on Monday morning is real. But understanding where that feeling actually comes from changes its meaning. It stops being evidence that something is wrong with you, and starts looking instead like evidence of exactly how old, how capable, and how relentlessly protective your own brain has always been. There's a particular kind of relief in simply renaming the feeling, not "I am dreading Monday because my life or my job is bad." Instead, something closer to an ancient alarm system, exquisitely tuned for a world of real predators, has mistaken my calendar for a clearing full of danger. That reframe doesn't make the feeling vanish, but it changes your relationship to it. You stop arguing with the dread, trying to convince it that everything will be fine, which rarely works, since the dread was never listening to reason in the first place. Instead, you simply notice it, the way you might notice weather rolling in. A pressure system, a pattern, not a verdict on your life. It also helps to remember that the specific shape of your dread says almost nothing about how the actual day will unfold. The mind, when left to imagine an uncertain future, almost always reaches for the worst available version of events, not because that version is more likely, but because, as you now know, An ancient asymmetry in the cost of being wrong taught your ancestors to imagine danger first and reassess afterward. The presentation you are dreading will very likely go fine. The meeting you are rehearsing disasters for will very likely be ordinary. Not because you are certain of it, but because the overwhelming majority of ordinary days across the overwhelming majority of human history have in fact turned out to be ordinary. Dramatic, life-altering Mondays are vanishingly rare. Quietly unremarkable ones make up nearly all of them. You did not start hating Mondays because you are weak or lazy or somehow uniquely broken compared to everyone around you who seems to handle it fine. Plenty of people around you are quietly fighting the exact same ancient reflex, often without realizing it has a name, a mechanism, and a history stretching back long before the 7-day week, long before email, long before anyone ever called a meeting for 9 in the morning. You started hating Mondays because, somewhere behind your ribs, an ancient and remarkably capable part of your brain is still standing at the edge of a clearing, still scanning the shadows for movement, still trying, in its clumsy and wildly outdated way, to keep you alive. And tonight, when Sunday comes around again, and that small alarm starts ringing for an event that hasn't happened yet, you will know something your ancestors never had the chance to know. The danger isn't real. The shape moving in the grass is only a calendar. And the part of you that's afraid isn't broken at all. It's simply very, very old, still doing the only job it has ever known how to do.